There is a building in the heart of Paris that has been, at various points in its history, a medieval fortress, a royal palace, a revolutionary symbol, a Napoleonic trophy room, and the most visited art museum on Earth. It has been abandoned by the kings who built it, stormed by the people they ruled, and transformed into something neither side could have predicted. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, architectural drawings, and archival images to life, allowing us to walk through the Louvre across 8 centuries of reinvention, from the first stones laid on the banks of the Seine to the glass pyramid that still divides opinion today. The Louvre is not a single story, it is dozens of stories layered on top of one another, each generation inheriting a building that meant something different to the one before. And somehow, through all of it, the structure endured, changing its face, changing its purpose, but never quite disappearing. Most people who visit the Louvre today have no idea they are standing above a fortress. But beneath the grand Renaissance wings, beneath the polished floors and the gilded ceilings, the original Louvre still exists. Its foundations preserved underground, visible to anyone willing to descend into the medieval crypt below the Cour Carrée. The first Louvre was built around 1190 by Philippe II of France, known as Philippe Auguste. He was preparing to go on the Third Crusade and was deeply concerned about leaving Paris undefended. His solution was a large defensive tower, a donjon, set at the southwestern corner of the city's new defensive wall, positioned to guard the most vulnerable approach to Paris from the Seine. It was not a palace. It was not meant to be beautiful. It was a military installation, a round tower roughly 15 meters in diameter, rising above a moat, designed to store weapons, hold prisoners, and project the authority of the French crown over the western gate of the capital. A striking contrast to what it would become. The building that would one day house the Mona Lisa began its life as a weapons depot and jail. The distance between those two things tells you almost everything about the history of France. For nearly 2 centuries, the fortress sat largely outside the city's inhabited core, used as a treasury and occasional prison, but not as a residence. That began to change in the 1360s when King Charles V decided to move his court there and commissioned a significant transformation. He added living quarters, a library of extraordinary scope, over 900 volumes remarkable for the time, and gardens. The donjon remained, but the character of the place began to shift. Charles V's Louvre was reportedly one of the most refined residences in Europe, but it did not last. After his death, the court moved on, the building fell into neglect, and for much of the 15th century it reverted to military use. The library was sold off, the gardens disappeared. The great improvement of one reign was quietly undone by the indifference of the next. This pattern, a king invests enormously in the Louvre, his successors ignore it, would repeat itself more than once over the following centuries. The Louvre has always reflected the priorities of whoever held power in France, and French kings, it turned out, had very different ideas about what mattered. The Louvre, as we recognize it architecturally, begins with François I. He was the king who invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, who imported Renaissance ideas wholesale from Italy, and who decided that the medieval fortress on the Seine was an embarrassment unworthy of a modern monarch. In 1527, François announced his intention to live in Paris and to make the Louvre his primary residence. He had the old medieval donjon demolished. The tower that had defined the site for 3 centuries was simply pulled down and cleared away. In its place, he commissioned a new palace in the Italian Renaissance style, designed by the architect Pierre Lescot in collaboration with the sculptor Jean Goujon. The result was the southwestern wing of what is now the Cour Carrée, and it is still there, largely unchanged if you know where to look. The Lescot wing is a masterpiece of French Renaissance architecture. Its rhythmic bays, its carved reliefs, its balance of grandeur and delicacy. It set the visual language that would define the Louvre for the next 2 centuries. François died in 1547 before the work was complete, but he had changed the Louvre's identity permanently. It was no longer a fortress with pretensions, it was now a palace with ambitions. The decades after François I brought a succession of kings and a succession of additions, each one expanding the Louvre's footprint along the Seine. But the most consequential project of this period was not the Louvre itself, it was what was built beside it. In 1564, Catherine de' Medici, regent for her young son Charles IX, commissioned an entirely new palace to the west of the Louvre, the Tuileries Palace. She wanted a residence she could call entirely her own, separate from the established court structures of the Louvre. The Tuileries Tuileries was to be grander, more modern, surrounded by formal gardens that stretched toward what is now the Place de la Concorde. The two palaces stood separately for a time, connected only by the Seine. Then Henry IV, one of the most energetic builders in French royal history, had the audacity to connect them. Between 1595 and 1610, he constructed the Grand Gallery, a building nearly half a kilometer long running along the river, linking the Louvre to the Tuileries in a single continuous structure. It was, at the time, one of the longest buildings in the world. Henry IV barely finished it before he was assassinated in 1610. But the Grand Gallery transformed the Louvre complex from a palace into something closer to a city block, a vast interconnected structure that hugged the Seine for nearly half a kilometer. The shape of the Louvre that visitors recognize today was beginning to emerge. Louis XIV inherited the Louvre at the age of 4 and eventually became the king most associated with French royal grandeur. He invested heavily in the Louvre in his early reign, commissioning the famous East Façade, the Colonnade, from Claude Perrault, which remains one of the great set pieces of French classical architecture. He brought in the greatest architects, the greatest artists, the greatest minds of the age, and then he left. In 1682, Louis moved the French court entirely to Versailles, a new palace he was building 17 kilometers southwest of Paris, and the Louvre was effectively abandoned as a royal residence. The king, who had done so much to beautify it, simply decided he preferred somewhere else. His reasons were partly political. Paris was a city of crowds, unrest, and memory, including the memory of the Fronde, the aristocratic rebellion that had forced the young Louis to flee the capital as a child. Versailles offered control. It was his creation, on his terms, far from the unpredictable rhythms of the city. The Louvre did not stand empty exactly. Artists and craftsmen took over studios within the complex. The Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture held its famous salons there, exhibitions that attracted enormous public interest. But as a seat of power, the Louvre had been set aside. It would take a revolution to give it a new purpose. In the summer of 1789, France tore itself apart. The monarchy that had built the Louvre, expanded it, abandoned it, and occasionally returned to it was swept away in a matter of months. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were removed from Versailles by a crowd of Parisian women and brought back to the capital, back specifically to the Tuileries Palace, now transformed from a royal pleasure ground into something uncomfortably close to a gilded cage. The question of what to do with the vast royal collections, the paintings, the sculptures, the objects accumulated by French kings over centuries became urgent. These were not simply beautiful things. They were, in the eyes of the revolution, the property of the nation, not of one family. Art that had decorated the private apartments of kings ought to belong to the people. On August 10, 1793, the first anniversary of the storming of the Tuileries and the formal abolition of the monarchy, the Louvre opened as a public museum. The Grande Galerie was filled with paintings. Anyone could walk in. Admission was free. It was a radical act dressed as a cultural one. The Palace of Kings returned to its citizens. The revolutionary government understood the symbolism perfectly. The Louvre as a museum was not just a practical solution to the question of where to put the royal art collection. It was a statement about who France now was and about who it had left behind. If the revolution gave the Louvre its purpose, Napoleon gave it its ambition. When Napoleon came to power, the museum was already established but still relatively modest. He saw in it something far grander, the opportunity to make Paris the cultural capital of the world, and the Louvre the repository of everything magnificent that Europe had to offer. The mechanics of this vision were, to put it diplomatically, acquisitive. As Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, works of art followed in their wake, requisitioned from Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Egypt, and beyond. The Louvre filled with masterpieces: Raphael, Titian, Veronese, ancient Greek sculpture, Egyptian antiquities. At its peak, the collection was arguably the greatest single accumulation of art in human history. Napoleon renamed it the Musée Napoleon and continued the architectural expansion of the palace itself, commissioning the northern Richelieu wing and beginning work on the Grand Courtyard. He also began the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel, the smaller triumphal arch that still stands just outside the Louvre, to celebrate his military victories. After Waterloo in 1815, much of what had been taken was returned. The Dutch sent envoys with carts. The Italians reclaimed their Raphaels. The great collection shrank shrank back to something more like what a single country could legitimately claim, but the institutional ambition remained. The Louvre had developed a logic of its own, a drive to collect, to display, to be the largest and the best, that outlasted the emperor who had imposed it. The Louvre that visitors see today, its great U-shaped wings embracing the Cour Napoleon, was largely completed during the reign of Napoleon III in the 1850s and 1860s. The architect Louis Visconti and then Hector Lafoelle filled in the northern wing, built the grand ceremonial staircases, and gave the complex something it had never quite had before, a sense of finished intention. For the first time, the Louvre looked like it was meant to look the way it looked. But completion brought with it a final devastating chapter in the palace's story. During the Paris Commune of 1871, the radical uprising that briefly held the city after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the Tuileries Palace, the western anchor of the complex that Henry IV had connected to the Louvre with his Grande Galerie, was set on fire by retreating communards. It burned for 3 days. When the smoke cleared, the Tuileries was a gutted shell. The decision was eventually taken not to rebuild it. The Wayo ruins were cleared in 1882. The western end of the Louvre complex was left open, which is why if you stand in the Cour Napoleon today and look west, there is nothing there. The gardens of the Tuileries stretch away toward the Place de la Concorde, and the palace that once closed the vista simply does not exist, a ghost in the city's geometry. By the latter half of the 20th century, the Louvre was struggling. Its collections had grown enormously, but its infrastructure had not kept pace. The main entrance on the Rue de Rivoli was inadequate. Visitors queued in the wrong places, got lost and left, having seen a fraction of what was on offer. The building was magnificent, but the experience of visiting it was, frankly, a mess. In 1981, President François Mitterrand launched the Grand Louvre project, one of the most ambitious architectural interventions France had undertaken since Haussmann redesigned Paris in the 19th century. The centerpiece was a new entrance hall to be built in the center of the Cour Napoleon, connected to the existing wings underground. For the architect, Mitterrand chose the Chinese-American Eo Ming-pei, whose proposal was startling, a glass pyramid 21 meters high, rising from the center of the courtyard. Paris was outraged. The debate was fierce and genuine. On one side, those who felt that a modernist glass structure had no place in the center of one of the great historic monuments of Western civilization. On the other, those who argued that great buildings have always been shaped by the interventions of their own time, that the Louvre itself is a palimpsest of contradictions, and that adding one more would be entirely in keeping with its history. The pyramid opened in 1989 to coincide with the bicentenary of the French Revolution, and something remarkable happened. Paris changed its mind. The structure worked. The underground entrance hall resolved centuries of logistical chaos. The pyramid itself, transparent, geometrically pure, reflecting the stone of the Louvre's facades without competing with them, became, within a generation, inseparable from the identity of the city. Today it is one of the most photographed structures in the world. The controversy is remembered mostly as a historical curiosity. The Louvre today receives somewhere in the region of 9 million visitors a year, making it consistently the most visited art museum in the world. Its collection numbers over 380,000 objects, of which around 35,000 are on display at any time, across 8 curatorial departments spanning antiquity to the mid-19th century. To see everything would take years. Most visitors see a fraction, drawn inevitably toward the same handful of icons. The Mona Lisa is the most visited painting in the world, protected behind bulletproof glass in her own dedicated room, viewed daily by crowds so dense that the painting itself is difficult to see clearly. Leonardo brought it to France when he came at the invitation of François I, the same king who began the Renaissance transformation of the Louvre. It has been in France ever since. 5 centuries of unbroken connection between the painting and the palace. The winged Victory of Samothrace stands at the top of the Daru staircase, headless and armless and somehow more powerful for it, the stone drapery frozen in a wind that stopped 2,000 years ago. The Venus de Milo stands in her own gallery, drawing visitors who have come specifically and only to see her. These objects are not decorations in a building, they are the reason the building exists. What is striking about the Louvre today is not its scale, though its scale is extraordinary, but the strange continuity it embodies. The medieval foundations are still there, beneath the floor, lit and labeled for visitors who choose to go looking. The Lescaut wing that François I commissioned still forms one side of the Cour Carrée. The Grande Galerie, where the Revolution first opened the collection to the public, still runs along the Seine. And in the center of the courtyard, a glass pyramid built in 1989 catches the afternoon light and sends it underground, where 8 centuries of decisions converge in a single entrance hall. Standing in front of the pyramid as the sun goes down and the lights come on inside the glass, it is hard not to feel how completely the Louvre resists a single definition. It was built for defense and became a symbol of power. It was built for kings and given to the people. It was filled with the art of other nations and became the custodian of that art across centuries. It was half destroyed and rebuilt, abandoned and reclaimed, modernized and controversially improved. Every age has looked at this building and decided it needed to be something different, and somehow the building has absorbed every one of those decisions without losing its essential identity. It is still recognizably itself. It is still in some fundamental way the same place that Philippe Auguste chose for his fortress on the banks of the Seine. If there is another palace, another museum, or another monument shaped by centuries of human ambition that you would like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments. I would love to keep building this journey into the past with you.